So, last time we were here, I don't even remember what we talked about because it was a while ago. I'm sorry for kind of being a little bit sporadic recently. I have been moving. I just recently moved in, as in 2 days ago, just moved into a new place. Oops. Oh yeah, we talked about dealing in the drug war. So today we're going to talk about a really, really important topic, which is the communities that have been impacted by the war on drugs. And if you haven't muted yourself already, please do so. Or I will do it. And Danita, in answer to your question, I am 2 blocks from where I was prior. So, but anyway, it's still a move. Things are still happening. So this is a really important subject, and because of it, I'm going to give a couple disclaimers. But until then, can anyone give me some names of some major drug kingpins? Anyone remember the names of major narco traffickers, like very famous drug traffickers? El Chapo?
Technically, Al Capone.
Al Capone, Pablo Escobar. That's right. And in the interest of
Freeway
time,
Ricky
who else?
Ross. Freeway Ricky Ross.
Freeway Rick Ross. That's right. He was a major crack trafficker. Now, in the interest of time, I'll give you a couple other ones. People like Mr. X in the Philippines, who we didn't really go into great detail of. The CIA. That's good. Yeah, we'll get back into kind of talking about government conspiracies and the involvement of CIA in various drug dealing operations, I think next time, actually. So some major kingpins, Griselda Blanco, Pablo Escobar, and Freeway Rick Ross were 3 major ones. And Pablo Escobar and Griselda Blanco were predominantly based in South America, but also operated in the cocaine trade in Florida and, dealing in cannabis as well. Whereas Freeway Rick Ross was predominantly located in Los Angeles, and he was a participant in the crack trade. Am I very latent for you guys right now? Am I kind of lagging?
Sounds good, actually.
Okay. Then in terms of the chain of command, we start with the growers or manufacturers, and then from there we have, this is backwards. I don't know why this is like this. The chain of command starts with the growers or manufacturers, the people that harvest and then synthesize or make or whatever the drugs in the first place to get product. And then you have the people that are responsible for moving those drugs. So smugglers are transporting across lines between countries or states, etc., whereas transporters are moving within regions. And then you have that kind of transferred down the line of command to the actual foot soldiers, the dealers themselves. And at the top, or kind of nebulously controlling this entire process, might be a narco trafficker or a drug kingpin, a drug lord, whatever you want to call them. So this, for instance, was Frank Lucas, who was participant in the Cadaver Connection, which was this theory that he was smuggling heroin in the bodies of dead Vietnam soldiers in their caskets. It was in the caskets, not in the soldiers, I don't think. But he didn't actually do that, apparently. It was antique furniture that had been hollowed out, and he started this as a rumor for some reason. Anyone remember, also, spurned is not the right word here. I should change that right now. Spurred. Okay, what spurred drastic increases in violence in Mexico in 2007? Does anyone remember this? Does anyone know what happened? So that Mexico, which had previously not had a crazy number of homicides related to drugs in particular, all of a sudden the homicide rates went way up. Anyone know what happened? Turf wars between local cartels, America got involved. So in terms of the turf war between local cartels, that is partially true through time. That is something that has happened that's caused an increase in violence. But the thing about America getting involved is really what I'm getting at, because America kind of pushed the Mexican government to start intervening. And because of that, the Mexican government started intervening with military force. And as soon as the military got involved, all of a sudden, the cartels were militarizing, civilians were militarizing. It became an issue of defend or be killed. So it was military intervention that made the death rates go way up from where they were before. What is one reason that Honduras has such a high murder rate? Anyone know this one? It's a hard one. I know it's been a week. Think about what might pass through Honduras. Come on, you got it. Don't think too hard. What's a drug that might pass through a region that might bring violence with it? Cocaine, exactly, yes. So Honduras is a place where most of the cocaine, if not all of the cocaine going to America, passes through. And in the process, it becomes a turf war. It becomes a place where a lot of the shipments are being intercepted and are being sent in the first place. It gets very complicated. What was the crack to cocaine sentencing ratio imposed by the Reagan administration? When the Reagan administration decided to criminalize crack versus cocaine, how did they do it? 4-1, you're close. Oh, actually, no, you're not close. It's 100-1. It's 100-1 ratio. And this is for possessing 5 grams of crack cocaine, for just possessing 5 grams of crack cocaine is punishable in the same way as dealing 500 grams of regular cocaine. So 5 grams of possession, punishable in the same way, minimum 5 years, as selling 500 grams of coke. 100-1 ratio. What pivotal event in 1984 caused incarceration rates to skyrocket? What happened in 1984? Who was president then, and what did they do? Wasn't Nixon, although he was a very important player in this. He was a little bit before that, though. He was the early 70s. This was Reagan, right? This is the Reagan administration. The Just Say No campaign started, and Reagan vowed to be tough on crime. And this tough on crime mentality is what really pushed things over the edge. The privatization of prisons is what really got the ball rolling on incarceration. And we're going to look at incarceration and privatization very soon today. Anyone recognize what this might be? What's in these bottles? What's happening? Meth? It's a specific method of making meth. Anyone remember what it's called? Shake and bake. Yes, you guys are killing it today. This is good. Okay, so shake and bake is DIY meth production. And again, if I'm talking too quickly about this, just feel free to call me out and slow me down. I'm just trying to get through this whole lecture today. So shake and bake involves an actual bottle or a container that is physically shaken, and sometimes if you don't open it often enough to let the pressure out, it can explode, which has led to injuries from meth production in the past. We're not going to go too deep into these. These are the the Sinaloa cartel tunnels, and these were dug underneath the U.S.-Mexico border to transport drugs. So that's really good for a wall, you know what I mean? And then Griselda Blanco, and she was a ruthless Colombian kingpin of the Medellin cartel. And in the late 80s, the cocaine cowboys were shootouts that would happen in broad daylight in Miami, and she was a major perpetuator of these. Okay, before we get into this today, this is a really important acknowledgement that I want to make, which is that I am a white person. Shock of shocks here. I don't belong to the marginalized communities that I'm about to talk about in this lecture. The reason that I am here speaking about them is to bring awareness to the fact that these issues exist. But the voices that you should listen to first and foremost are those impacted here and everywhere else. So despite the fact that I am presenting information on this, you need to do your own research. You need to listen to marginalized demographics first and foremost, but know what's going on and have a basis of understanding of why it's so critical for us to be listening as calmly and as humbly as possible when these issues are brought up. So if anyone ever has any issue with the way that I bring up this information, the content of the information, anything at all pertaining to my own whiteness and my own privilege, please feel free to either submit an anonymous feedback form on the website or email me directly, talk to me directly, whatever you want to do, and let's have a conversation. Now, to give kind of a basis of understanding for this entire issue, I want to lay the framework of why there are certain demographics that are so much more impacted by the war on drugs than others. And this is a key thing that I think a lot of people forget to think about when they think about drug policy and the war on drugs, is that this is a cycle. And many, many things go into this cycle. So whenever, for instance, I post as Dance Safe about people of color or anything related to racial justice or to poverty or to mental health or physical health, and people are like, stay in your lane, it's almost comical because the war on drugs is like a highway. It's got many lanes and they all comprise this thing. It's not just drugs, it's everything that goes into it. And this starts oftentimes with poverty and low-income communities. but we'll look also at how low income kind of like percolates and perpetuates itself. Having prior convictions, your socioeconomic status, your mental health, your drug use, all of these things are going to impact whether or not you are disproportionately affected by drugs, if you're in a marginalized community in any of these senses or others. So for instance, let's take a look at CISA, which is meth and battery acid combination that rose to prominence in Greece a couple of years ago after the fall of the market, but specifically impacted low-income communities. And we'll see if it'll ever let me play this video correctly. Just see why.
Last time I was in Greece in 2011, they were carving each other's heads in during riots which would eventually lead to the resignation of the Prime Minister, George Papandreou. 3 prime ministers later, and the situation in Greece isn't much better. Extremist politics, civil unrest, and of course poverty continue to rip it apart. Now perhaps the most insidious problems in Athens are homelessness and the spiraling drug problem. Just driving through Athens, it becomes clear that there are a lot of drugs on the streets. People shoot heroin in broad daylight, and dealers are easy to spot. But we've been hearing about a new drug that's taking over. A drug called CISA.
Πέθανε ήδη πάρα πολλά παιδιά. Ενώ με την ηρωίνη και την κοκαίνη δεν πέθανε τόσο κόσμος. Συνήθως άνθρωποι οι οποίοι ζουν στον δρόμο και δεν έχουν χρήματα για να κάνουν χρήση άλλων ουσιών. I think it's the worst drug ever. In the world, you know. CISA is the worst drug. The worst drug ever. CISA. It's not crystal meth. It's not. It's worse than that. Το CISA είναι σαν την κόκα των φτωχών και εξαπλώνεται πιο γρήγορα ο θάνατος.
Reports on CISA are rare, and little is known about the drug, but most rumors claim that it's a cheap derivative of crystal meth, cut with a cookbook of god-awful poisonous supplements. The name itself derives from the Persian word for glass, shisha, that is often used to describe glass pipes in Arabic and African countries. Supposedly, CISA sends its users into mindless violent states and can end up killing them within months. We wanted to find out more, so we went to Athens to meet the people who take CISA and to try and get a look at the stuff ourselves.
Really interesting Vice mini doc. Love these. Haven't mentioned that before. We're not going to get super into the specifics of CISA, but I want to use this as an initial cornerstone example of how socioeconomic status, of how poverty can completely influence the way that drugs and drug laws impact a person. This has never been about like an equitable situation where everyone is equally impacted by the way that drugs are scheduled. We'll come back to more of that in a little bit. So another kind of example of this is caffeine, and this is the probably least insidious of the many substances that we'll talk about because caffeine has a relatively low risk physiologically. Like if you have high blood pressure, it can cause problems, but caffeine in and of itself isn't as physiologically prone to harming a person as other substances might be. Its risk profile is somewhat lower than some other drugs. Now, obviously, right? But it is important to note also that there are still trends that we can see here of, whoops. Seriously? Oh my God, please. Well, it can give you the runs. Yes, that's true. There's a great meme of a wrestler standing behind a guy and the guy is labeled with a nice cup of coffee and the wrestler is labeled with poop. So anyway, it is a fact as well, numerically speaking, that lower income Americans consume approximately, I think 33% more coffee or caffeine than higher income Americans. And this says something, right? Like the lower your income is, the more caffeine you drink. And this is just reflective of a larger social trend, obviously, of like if you're working more and you need to earn money in a higher stress environment, a more demanding environment, a more blue collar environment, caffeine is probably going to be something that you would lean on more. But this also speaks to other things, right? The fact that people in low income environments are frequently forced to use wakefulness agents to get through the day, which implies that they probably don't get as much sleep, which implies that they probably are going to have health complications related to lack of sleep and stress, which implies that their health bills might be higher, and all kinds of other stuff in that vein. And this is like a micro example of a much bigger issue, right? This is a symptom of a problem. And now if we move on to tobacco, it's a lot more obvious. You have marginalized populations that are way more likely to use tobacco than other populations. So for instance, people who inject drugs are extremely commonly tobacco smokers as well. And tobacco is marketed with intention in low-income communities. Like, it is given a huge amount of funding and attention within communities that are more vulnerable, that might be more intrigued by tobacco, for instance. The higher a person's education rate is, the higher or the lower they are, please, the lower likelihood of them being a regular tobacco smoker. And like, this is pretty clear, right? Like, there isn't much room for discrepancy here. It is true that the higher your income and the fewer systemic obstacles you face, the less likely you are to use a substance that is known to be extremely cancer causing. Like, this is just like very plainly visible here. But if you think about it, this also has implications for the long-term effects on that person and their life and their family, and all these things that could be influenced by the fact that they are using a substance that is known to cause physiological harm to them. Now, we have to ask ourselves why these people would use tobacco in the first place. And the most obvious initial answer is that it's a stress relieving technique, and it's also a social technique, but stress relieving. But then we look deeper into it and we see that this marketing exploits these communities. And this is like a contributor to the cycle of health. Now, smoking and caffeine are like concurrent, right? People that smoke cigarettes are approximately 1.5 times as heavy caffeine consumers as non-smokers. So these things are, there we go again, me using the word spurns wrong. I can't believe I got away with that for so long. But these are clearly correlated, right? We have a stress relieving agent and we have a wakefulness agent that are directly tied to a person's income, right? And a person's education level. So this tiny, tiny example of how a person's health might be impacted by their income and their concurrent substance use really gives us like insight into what's going on here. We'll come back to that in a second as well. And now we look at your income and how long you live. And all these things start to blur together. Obviously, there are a lot of factors that go into lifespan, but we see that the wealthier you are, the longer you live. Now, putting all this together, right? If you're wealthier and better educated, technically speaking, you are less likely to use cigarettes and your caffeine consumption drops, okay? Your lifespan also increases. And these things are related. They are. The fact of the matter is that if you are struggling on a regular basis socioeconomically, and you're using substances that are going to help you get through that experience, in some cases, this can really cause strain on your cardiovascular system. This can cause health complications. This can change your blood pressure. And all of these things contribute to a cycle of hospitalization or hospital bills and debt and increased anxiety about debt. And it spirals, absolutely spirals. Now, to get into the probably more important part of this, we can very clearly stratify income by race in the United States as well. And when we look at race and drugs, we'll start to see this weird disconnect that happens here, which is that in the United States, Black Americans, or BIPOC, have the lowest income level of all of these brackets. Now, there are two ways to look at this. The first is to say that Black, Indigenous, people of color are not as smart or capable as their counterparts in the United States, which is overtly inherently racist. If that's your explanation for why this income stratification happens, that's overtly inherently racist. The other thing is that there is systemic inequity. There's no alternative, right? Like, it's either an overtly racist viewpoint of why this stratification is happening, or an acknowledgement of the systems that are in place to make it so. So this is important to keep in mind when we're looking at topics like this. And oftentimes, Native populations aren't even included in the census for income. Like on this chart, for instance, Native populations are completely left off of it, despite the fact that many Indigenous groups live well under the poverty level, Consider donating to COVID relief situations with the Hopi and Navajo in the United States. Now, looking at drugs now, we see heroin, for instance, and we see that the highest populations of people that use heroin have the lowest income bracket, live under the poverty line. And we want to avoid doing correlation equals causation here. Like, a major argument that is often made is that people have lower income because they're using heroin, for instance. But it's just not that simple. There are so many factors that go into this. Oh, wow, that's bad. That's really bad. But that's like a commonly held sentiment, right? I'm responding to something in the chat that I'm not going to read for time's sake. And if we look at income and alcohol levels, we see that the lower your education level is, the higher the amount of alcohol consumed, although interestingly, the preference shifts from beer to wine in higher education levels, which is bosh. And then also seeing that like it's income and education often go hand in hand with this, because income frequently affords education. Now, I know that that was just a lot of like graphs and very quick explanations of things that I just spouted out. So here's the TLDR of that segment. Your income is impacted by your race, which is impacted by systemic inequity. All these things are tied together. Your income influences your drug use, which influences your health, which influences your money, which influences your income, which influences your family. Do you kind of see how these things start working together? We'll come back to all that. Now, I know that I've shown this chart a whole bunch of times, and someone actually contacted me to ask me specifically if I could give them the original. This was, I think this was a study done by Dr. David Nutt, who we'll revisit a little bit later. Great name, great guy. And it was basically exploring the relative harms of drugs, harms to users versus harms to others. Now, consistently, alcohol tops these charts. Whenever we're looking at the actual harm caused by drugs, not the perceived harm, not the supposed harm, the actual harm caused by drugs, alcohol frequently, if not always, comes out on top. But it's legal. It's the only legal one for the most part. Yeah, it's the only legal one except for tobacco among these. And tobacco also ranks really high up there. Why is this the case? You know, like, what happened here? And the answer obviously is that prohibition happened and people got pissed. White people got pissed. White people had a drug that they liked taken away from them, staged a massive tantrum, and got it back. TLDR, that's what happened, right? So it's just like an interesting thing to think about how tobacco and alcohol are so consistently rated so highly on the drugs harms chart. And I'm sure that all of you have thought about this at some point and been like, why are these drugs, which are inherently more physiologically dangerous than other drugs, so high up in terms of legality? Like, how did that happen? And I know we've all probably thought that at some point. And the answer is that people fought for them and got mad that they were not available to them anymore, basically. But it's very revealing as well in other ways. So to be clear, the harm chart is attempting to be independent of how many people use the drug. Yes, and this is a really good point that some people have brought up about this chart, which is that when we're looking to the, or when we're looking at the impact of a drug currently, it takes into consideration potentially its legality right now. So obviously, if something like alcohol is widely available to a lot of people at this point in time, the data is going to be a lot more prevalent. Like, you're going to have a lot more crime associated with alcohol, a lot more death associated with alcohol because it's so available. But as far as I'm aware, this chart is independent of that. This chart is looking specifically at the potential for this drug, the rate of incident for this drug to cause harm to the user or have the user cause harm to others in some way. So let's rewind a little bit to the marketing part of things. Okay, let's see how exactly income and race and gentrification all come into this in this horrible, ugly little pie of prohibition, the prohibition pie. So approximately 72% of people that smoke are low income. Just let that number sink in. Approximately, right? Like, this is an exact number. It's hard to collect this data. 72% of smokers are low income. Now, in response to this, liquor stores intentionally have more advertising for tobacco products in the front of their stores, like cigarette banners and like cigarettes pushed to the front of the cash register in low-income neighborhoods. tobacco companies put more money into low-income neighborhoods than higher-income neighborhoods, especially around schools, which we'll revisit in just a second. Now, in addition to this, tobacco companies have actually genetically engineered their tobacco to have approximately twice as much nicotine content as it used to. But this isn't being heavily marketed. So cigarettes are often a lot more dependence forming, a lot more addiction forming than they were prior because of this genetically modified tobacco that is intended to be more intense and more rewarding. Now, this issue of cigarettes around schools has been going on for a long time and employing tactics to get low-income people to smoke. And we haven't talked that much about tobacco and nicotine in this class because there is a lot more information available on it than other illicit substances. But this is a huge one, right? Obviously, this is a huge one, and it shouldn't be left out of this equation because I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but at points in the past, and I think actually still to this day, coupons for cigarettes are sent out with food stamps. So if you're receiving food stamps in the mail, you might get a coupon for a pack with it. That's intentional. That is on purpose. Tobacco companies understand that their target audience is often people who are stressed the fuck out. And additionally, there was a scandal with tobacco companies who would actually set up shop basically on playgrounds and would offer free cigarettes to kids in the 80s. Yes, food stamps currently work with EBT, debit card, etc. But to my knowledge, there are actually still, I'm not positive on this, but to my knowledge, there are still tobacco companies that send out coupons to targeted audiences, like specifically people that are on food stamps or low income. Don't quote me on that because I'm not positive like how recent that is, but like this is a thing that has happened consistently through time. Now, menthol is a whole other part of this that people don't even really think about. But menthol is really prominent in Black communities. And part of the reason for this is that this was, again, intentionally marketed. Menthol was intentionally marketed to Black communities. And part of the appeal with menthol is that it's a cooling sensation on the throat, which has been shown to make people smoke longer and have like deeper drags because it doesn't hurt as much. And in the process, people develop, again, a stronger sense of either physiological or psychological dependence or addiction on nicotine because they're smoking more without realizing it because the menthol makes it easier to smoke consistently. And it's also been marketed as being healthier in the past, which is obviously completely untrue. But what is menthol compared to a cigarette? A menthol cigarette is like flavored with menthol. Like it has mint basically in it that cools down the throat. Menthols make it harder for me to quit. Yes, menthols are a sneaky, sneaky, sneaky addition to cigarettes. All right, switching gears to drugs, like illicit ones again. So we have all this backstory about how money goes into targeting low-income communities, and those low-income communities are often made up of other marginalized demographics, and this cycle starts where money's being spent on substances that cause addiction or dependence or what have you, or problematic use in general, or just like develop a problematic relationship with substances. And in the process, health starts to deteriorate, things stack up. So let's look at crack. Now I want you all to take a second and look at each of these graphs individually. And you should actually do this because this is a really good exercise in identifying false information. So this one, we have a chart. These I just pulled off of Google. I have a chart here, past month crack users by race, 55% white, 37% Black. Then we have down here, crack cocaine versus cocaine use by race. We have much higher rate of cocaine use by white people and higher rate of crack cocaine use by white people. Then over here we have the race of drug offenders, and drug offenders are predominantly Black for crack cocaine specifically, and predominantly Hispanic for, yes, these are all in the US, Hispanic for powder cocaine. And then we have this one down here that shows that 81% or 82% of people who use crack are Black. What the fuck? all of these graphs are completely different in terms of the picture that they attempt to paint, right? None of them look that reputable either, except for the US Sentencing Commission, which is probably the most reputable of these graphs. But we need to really be careful whenever anyone is researching anything about drugs, because the vast majority of information that you find on the internet about drugs is biased. You cannot, like you can with some other things, just go to a website and pull a chart off of it and use it to prove a point. That's called confirmation bias. It's basically taking something that you think is true and pulling whatever evidence is available to support that, even if new information is presented that makes it obvious that you might not be right. And confirmation bias is the devil when it comes to drugs. So if you're doing your own independent research, be mindful of stuff like this and how this can happen, because watching how graphs can just be like so all over the place, depending on what kind of point they're trying to make, makes it very apparent how easy it is to make shit up. Now, looking at native populations are consistently overlooked in drugs. All the time, indigenous populations are left in the dust in these conversations. There is a very serious issue happening within native populations in the United States, where a combination of poverty and lack of resources has created a very vicious cycle of problematic drug use in many communities. There are higher rates of problematic substance use in native populations, generally lower access to resources like healthcare and education, and like even things like food stamps. It's just like harder to get essentials in populations that are extremely marginalized, particularly indigenous populations. So an example of this, which is something that you probably are all not familiar with because it's a bit niche, is this orange or this blue line represents the number of native kids in foster care in, I think this is in South Dakota. Yeah, this is in South Dakota. So approximately 13% of the foster care system in South Dakota is made up of native kids. 13% native kids. But then we look here at the number of prescription drug claims made for native kids in the foster care system. For some reason, there is a huge number of prescription drug claims made for foster care kids, specifically native foster care kids in the system. Now, part of the reason for this is that many of the folks working in social services have, or who are psychologists or pharmacists or, psychiatrists, don't have a cultural understanding of differences between white Americans and Native Americans. And because of this, there is an issue with massive overprescribing specifically to Native kids. This is just like another example of like how this, what do they mean by claims? Like requests put in for prescriptions. So this kind of like furthers this issue, right? Now, there are consequences of this, and these are not directly correlated, right? But we're seeing massive overdose increases in Native communities. What happened in 2006? I don't know. That's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. Something happened in 2006. That's a good observation. There are direct consequences from this, right? Like, there is an overdose crisis happening in Native communities, a 500% increase in overdoses, but we're not talking about it. We're seeing a huge spike in rural white populations in overdose, but we're not talking about the even bigger spike happening in Native populations because people don't fucking care enough, because America is the way America is. Like, people are not looking at what's happening outside of immediate populations, like white populations especially. Now, we're also seeing a much higher mortality rate from these drugs in Native populations. And part of this could be explained by a lack of overdose prevention training. Part of this could be explained by poor drug supply. Some of this could be explained by lack of education in the first place, lack of clean access to syringes, etc. It doesn't matter what it is, or like, okay, yes, obviously it matters what it is, because all of those things need to be implemented for this to stop happening. But what really matters in this chart, what we need to really look at, is just how high these mortality rates are. This is unacceptable. There's no reason for this. The fact that naloxone is not easier to access and that education is not easier to access in these communities is reflective of a systemic failing where they are not provided with the resources and materials that they need. Are we out of time? I guess we can do this. So here's the border wall in action.
You may have a cinematic idea of what
Americans we spoke with say their relationship with Border Patrol is complicated at best. Are they welcome in the nation?
Oh,
Say no. We're bringing in people who don't understand our culture, don't understand our people, don't understand our way of life. So therefore, there's resentment.
Verlin Jose is a tribal leader. His family's lived on this reservation for generations. We traveled hours off the main road to reach Verlin and members of his tribe. We met at what's called the Sacred Gate, the one place Native Americans can walk across the border where their land stretches into Mexico. This low fence is all that separates our two countries, a lone border agent and a light pole powered by a generator.
Drugs come through here, migrants come through here,
And with it, a myriad of problems.
homes are getting broken into, vehicles are being stolen. They seem to be getting more aggressive.
Aggressive. The cartel is becoming more aggressive, bringing their product through your community. The Border Patrol is becoming more aggressive to stop it.
Yeah.
And caught in the middle.
We're caught in the middle of it.
It sounds like your beloved nation is either the doorway or the doormat to the promised land for the drug trafficking and the human trafficking.
Unfortunately, that is correct.
I could say a lot on the border wall and what it's doing for the war on drugs, but this is, again, people who have been consistently caught in the crossfire, who are once again caught in the crossfire, right? Now, incarceration. I know we've spoken on this before, but I want to take our deepest dive yet into how exactly this works and what exactly is going on here. Black Americans are many times more likely to be arrested for drug-related crimes than white Americans, despite having approximately the same rate of drug use, if not less. There is no reason why this discrepancy in incarceration should be happening except for racially related aggression. And I hope that all of you have been following what's been happening in the world at large and in the United States in particular with police brutality and BLM. If you have not, this is my invitation to immediately get started in getting caught up. But these numbers should not be this way. Obviously that goes without saying, but like purely speaking from a statistical standpoint, the fact that this has been so egregiously imbalanced despite these similar, if not same rates of use is enormous. Now we can start to see this really happening in 1984 when the Reagan administration took over and started doing the Just Say No program and being aggressive in their incarceration policies. But notice the population that was impacted. It wasn't white people who were drastically impacted by the new Reagan administration incarceration policy. It was Black Americans that were incarcerated en masse. In fact, to this day, we see that even though the rate of drug use, as I've said before, is like very comparable between white and Black Americans and Hispanic or Latinx Americans, regardless of this, the prison population is completely different, okay? Now, a huge percentage of America's offenders / people who are incarcerated are in for nonviolent drug crimes, a huge percentage. I know I've said this before, but I hope that the statistic remains as staggering. The United States has 4% of the world's population and 25% of its prison population. We incarcerate a quarter of the people incarcerated worldwide, even though we only have less than 1/25 of its actual population. Now here's a look at how exactly this can happen and how the criminal justice system has gotten to where it is and how our criminal justice system is for profit. Like, yes, I'll be very clear about this. Our criminal justice system is for profit.
we don't worry about no criminals, we worry about the city officials.
the city officials are criminals. They took out my money. Nobody will believe this is the way we live in Paysdale.
Valerie Whitner is a Missouri resident making less than $30,000 a year, who has received roughly $1,200 in fines annually for the past 8 years. The city has threatened to bulldoze her home if she doesn't pay all of her citations for illicit barbecues and growing bamboo in her yard.
It's like they go into your bank account and say, I guess I need a couple of more dollars today. Let me go see if I can get Miss Whitner here up for a couple of hundred. Oh, by the way, Miss Whitner, it's a piece of siding up there that needs to be fixed. You got to cite you for that. Your grass is too high. Pay that ticket for not having blinds. Pay that ticket for having blinds. This don't make no sense. I have bamboo in my yard, and they cited me saying I had weed. You trying to sell me? I'm selling all kinds of my property. Now I'm getting ready to get mad because everybody know about my bamboo. He gave me a ticket because he wanted me to paint my garage. You see the brick? Who paints them kind of bricks? You're not gonna mess up my bricks. That's the kind of unconditional fear that you live in out here. Something as simple as that. Because you know you're gonna get a fine for it.
Now, what happens here is that in many areas of the United States, in particular low-income areas where you can get away with this, city officials and police will come around and cite you for quality of life fines or other minor citations for things that oftentimes people can't pay. Or you can't show up to your court date because you have work, and you get fired if you don't show up to work. So if you don't show up to your court date, you get more fines, which you still can't pay because you're impoverished. If you show up to your court date, you probably miss work, which means that you might get fired or you lose that money for the day, making you more impoverished and even less capable of fulfilling the demands of citations. Again, a microcosm example of a massive issue on a grander scale with how incarceration and citation and impoverishment are all related here. Let's take a look at private prisons. So I've mentioned this in the past, but let's look a little deeper at them. Now, private prisons house more people of color than public prisons, right? And I know that I've mentioned this before, but as a reminder, the way that private prisons effectively work is they will go to the United States government and say, hey, we can house your prisoners for cheaper because we can contract our own labor out and we'll like figure out a way to do it cheaper. If you were paying $100 a day for this prisoner in your federal prisons, we can do it for $80 a day at our prison. You just have to like give us the money and we'll take care of the rest. So US government is like, sure, I hate everybody, let's do it. And the private prisons can cut costs however they want. So they're still getting that money for those prisoners, but they don't have to follow sanitation guidelines or have any kind of checks and balances on the quality of their establishment or the corrections officers, whatever that means, prison guards. Now, obviously this leads to really huge human rights violations, a complete lack of oversight, and very serious, very bad conditions in many of these private prisons. But what also happens is that they get extremely wealthy off of this. In fact, per year, the Corrections Corporation of America, or CCA, makes in excess of $3,000 per year per prisoner in terms of profits, corporate profits. And the other thing here is that they have an agreement with the federal government that if their prisons are not a certain percentage full, then effectively taxpayers foot the bill for what they would have gotten paid for that prisoner. And it's usually in the 90s. It's usually like 90 to 100% full for this prison to be functional. And to make this happen, a lot of lobbying takes place. In many cases, these corporations will send representatives into a legal sphere to basically start fighting against laws that would make incarceration less profitable. They'll send people in to like rub elbows and wine and dine and be like, well, I mean, we probably should give some more money to ICE because that way, you know, we're going to have some more effective prison filling happening because they're like Disney villains. Now, I just mentioned these occupancy minimums, but these are prisons that have a 90% or higher occupancy contract. there are a lot of these prisons that specifically are like 90% of our beds need to be filled. Otherwise, other people are going to start paying. And obviously, this is incentivizing, right? This is incentivizing for police officers to arrest as many people as possible to fill these prisons. And police officers aren't directly incentivized by private prisons. They're incentivized by the federal government and the laws that the federal government passes. So it's really easy to just nab a ton of people for nonviolent drug crimes and incarcerate them. And we've already talked about asset forfeiture and other stuff like that. But this is a for-profit system. Incarcerating people is profitable for police officers, for private corporations, for the federal government. People make money off of prison. Here's a statement by the Corrections Corporation of America. Now, the background on this statement was that they're required legally to disclose to their investors things that might damage their ability to be profitable. So this wasn't them making some kind of sneaky statement, like this wasn't like a WikiLeaks email or something. This is them telling their investors, if this happens, then you might lose some money on us. But the fact that they have to say this in the first place is telling. Here's what it says. The demand for our facilities and services could be adversely affected by the relaxation of enforcement efforts, leniency in conviction or parole standards and sentencing practices, or through the decriminalization of certain activities that are currently prescribed by our criminal laws. For instance, any changes with respect to drugs and controlled substances or illegal immigration could affect the number of persons arrested, convicted, and sentenced, thereby potentially reducing demand for correctional facilities to house them. Legislation has been proposed in numerous jurisdictions that could lower minimum sentences for some nonviolent crimes and make more inmates eligible for early release based on good behavior. Basically, if we start treating people who use drugs not as criminals as much anymore, and if we stop arresting everyone who's undocumented all the time, we might not make as much money. That's what this is saying. Like, actually, that's what this is saying.
So I got caught off guard by something recently.
And if you guys haven't seen the documentary 13th, it's amazing and you need to watch it as soon as possible. But this is going to go into the 13th Amendment and the other reason that incarceration is so profitable.
It has to do with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery. The amendment reads, in part, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States." All of that made perfect sense to me, minus this one part, except as a punishment for crime. Basically, that says you can punish a criminal with slavery. And we do, all over the country, all the time. It's called prison labor. We're all sort of familiar with the idea. Prisoners making license plates is the classic example, but that is the tip of the iceberg. Across the country, convicts do work in carpentry, sewing, mining, packaging, firefighting, telemarketing, fish farming, and artisanal cheese making. That last one is why this is back in the news. Whole Foods took some flack for selling felon-made cheese, and at a pretty hefty markup. Now, according to the American Civil Liberties Union, this isn't inherently a problem.
Most prisoners want to work, and jobs for prisoners can be a very positive thing.
That's David Fauti from the ACLU's National Prison Project.
But given the vast power inequality between prisoners and their employers, there's also a real potential for exploitation and abuse.
That potential is grounded in the fact that this really is slave labor. Inmates can be forced to work as long as they're deemed fit, and can be punished if they don't, including in some cases with solitary confinement. And then there's the question of money. We don't have to pay prisoners a dime for their work. Some states do require that prisoners are paid, but courts have consistently ruled that any pay is, quote, by the grace of the state. In other words, just to be nice. Meaning, more broadly, that prisoners are highly vulnerable.
Prisoners can't unionize. If they're injured or killed on the job, in most states they're not protected by workers' compensation. So all of this creates a situation where the usual checks on employer exploitation and abuse simply don't operate.
This all means that there's no consistency in what prisoners are paid for those cheese wheels and telemarketing calls. Pay scales range from nothing to around the federal minimum wage, but many are paid under $1 an hour. And that can give the state what Fauti calls a perverse incentive to keep the prison population high.
Last year, when California was ordered to release some prisoners to relieve overcrowding, the state actually argued against it on the ground that it would reduce the state's access to prisoner labor.
Things get more uncomfortable when you consider that America does not have a great track record when it comes to prison labor. After the Civil War, Southern states struggled with a sudden lack of slave labor, thanks to the 13th Amendment. And their solution, in part, was to use that same clause, except as a punishment for crime, as a loophole. Many states passed broadly racist vagrancy laws that allowed authorities to pick up blacks on charges like loitering, imprison them when they couldn't pay fines, and lease them out en masse to places like plantations. In other words, the South got its slaves back. This system of convict leasing wasn't totally abolished until 1941. Back here in 2015, though, what are we supposed to think about prison labor? Prisoners are treated light years better today, whether they're working or not. But there are also so many more of them. Our prison system has exploded since the 1980s, giving America far and away the biggest prisoner population in the world. And that population is racially skewed in the extreme. Around 40% of prisoners are black, even though only about 13% of the country is overall. The 13th Amendment, the abolition of slavery, that happened 150 years ago. And now, 150 years later, we have this prison system instead. And according to David Fauti, we should think hard about why we do.
The purpose of incarceration should be to protect public safety, not to provide a captive labor force for the government.
Now, this also applies to immigration, right? Obviously, immigration and incarceration go hand in hand, but I want to call particular attention to this very interesting chart made by the Department of Homeland Security in 2007. We look at, there's so much to unpack in this chart. The first being that it's entitled Criminal Aliens Removed. You cannot possibly use more loaded and racist language in a chart like this than criminal aliens removed. There is no more intentional way of othering a demographic of people than by referring to them by their incarceration status, by the term alien, and referring to them as having been removed like pests. Now, even better on this chart is that the most prominent reason for arrest and incarceration is not drugs, it's dangerous drugs. They did not have to use the word dangerous here. This is a justification. This is an explanation. Immigration comes after that. Immigration is less prominent on this chart than dangerous drugs. Then we look at things like sexual assault and larceny and burglary and robbery. Violent crimes comprise a massively smaller portion of this chart than dangerous drugs and immigration and other. Approximately 1 in 5 people that are incarcerated on the state level are incarcerated for, is it the state level actually? I think it is, are incarcerated for a drug offense. Approximately half of people incarcerated on the federal level for drugs. Now, ICE's budget requires that they at least detain 34,000 undocumented people per year. Like, their budget has a mandatory minimum on how many people that they arrest for being undocumented immigrants in the United States. The people that use drugs are by far and away the largest demographic that's impacted here, by far and away. This little yellow bit at the bottom is the people that have been incarcerated for actually selling or manufacturing drugs. And this is for people that are just owning or using drugs. So the people that we are incarcerating are people that are just using substances. We're not arresting or taking down the people at the top, like so many law enforcement agencies would claim. That's simply quantitatively not what's happening, and even if we did, it's not going to do anything to change the drug trade. Uh-oh, am I going to be late? Now we can look at this in terms of money again, right? Like, we have a single person, let's say that we charge them with a misdemeanor for drug use. In the process of this, we have privatized systems that are getting paid money. So for instance, the people that are collecting the fines and the tickets, the people that are processing all of these things, this is like an actual company that makes the processing server, writes the code, it gets paid to do it. Then of course you have a jail, and all of the things that go into that are privatized. They're paid individually, they're paid privately. Even things like the phone company that's used is contracted. Like they get paid to participate in the system. People that are engaging in like commissary sales, for instance, or pharmaceutical sales within a prison system. And then, of course, there's bail bonds, like entire companies dedicated to bailing people out, and GPS ankle monitoring. Like someone makes those, right? Someone sells them, someone distributes them. And then you have even the minor stuff like sanitation supplies, transportation systems, even the people that make like the protective gear inside of like a bus that transport prisoners. It's all paid. It's all a system that runs off of money. This is why privatized prison systems make so much fucking profit, right? Like these processes are handled off. They're like, you take care of it, give us the package deal, like tell us what we owe you, basically. It's the last one. Okay.
Good morning, John. It's Friday. A few weeks ago, a company called Visually emailed me and was like, hey, Hank, if you could do a high-quality animated video on any issue in the world, what would you choose? Now, that was a hard choice, but I went with Incarceration in America because it is messed up. Now, crime is also messed up. Bad things happen to good people, and that's terrible, and something should be done about it. But we send people to prison to be punished, and to prevent them from doing bad things again, and to deter others from breaking the law. Punishment, corrections, and deterrence. Now, we have this habit of thinking of prisoners as something very external to society. After all, there are literal walls between them and society, walls capped with razor wire and watched over by people with guns. But millions of prisoners are released each year. Today's prisoners are tomorrow's neighbors, so corrections should probably be the most important piece of the incarceration pie. Unfortunately, it is not. We are, however, really good at punishment. America has about 4% of the world's people and about 25% of the world's incarcerated people. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. Over the last 30 years, that number has skyrocketed, increasing over 400%. 41% of American juveniles and young adults have been arrested by the time they turn 23. Children as young as 13 years old have been sentenced to die in prison. And our prisons violate international standards. Solitary confinement increases instability and violence in inmates and is considered by international law to be torture. But in America, it's not regulated by anyone except the prison officials. No judge, no jury. Arguably the most devastating form of punishment we enact in this country, and yet there is no appeals process. And you think it's hard to get a job in America? Well, we make it intentionally more difficult to get a job once you have a conviction on your record, not to mention just to live your life. Convicts are ineligible for welfare, student loans, public housing, food stamps, and are often socially disconnected from community and family support structures. So in addition to having high recidivism rates, they have very high rates of homelessness and suicide. Somewhere along the way, we started to think that being tough on crime meant being tough on criminals, but that's not the same thing. Punishment is only one piece of a much larger crime reduction pie, and it's an expensive one, with some institutions paying more than $100,000 per year per prisoner. Long prison sentences have helped to decrease crime, but no more than 25% of the decrease we've seen can be attributed to incarceration, and it costs far beyond just dollars. The cost is to people, to our country, to communities, to families, and to ourselves. The policy seems to be, if you committed a felony, we just give up on you. These wars on crime, wars on drugs, they are wars on people. The smart political move is to appear tough on crime because crime is scary. So we increased minimum sentences, we arrested more people, we sent more of them to prison. That's how we looked tough on crime. But the results are in. It's bad policy. It's cruel, it's short-sighted, and to continue this policy of mass incarceration would be foolish. We're living inside of a massive $75 billion per year failed experiment. 2010 was the first year in nearly 40 years that the number of incarcerated individuals in America did not increase. Policymakers are beginning to realize the magnitude of this failure, but there is a long way to go.
Let's be very clear as I end this for today, and we'll finish the last bit on Tuesday. The system is working exactly as it was intended to. When people say the system is broken, what they don't understand is that this was on purpose. Don't forget that. Don't forget the people that are currently incarcerated, because they have no way of contacting the outside world for the most part, and no way of being advocated for. That's all for today. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday, and we'll continue doing regular times again soon. Have a good night.